Hey everyone, an artist has reached out to me for help with what to do after you've broken down the painting into just light and shadow, maybe blocked in some basic colors and created a nice little scene here. But you want to take it to the next step, down the road of turning this into a believable work of art that really has a sense of 3 dimensions. I received this drawing from Rimu, who's done a great job of the basic forms, and they came to me for help with identifying what is a cast shadow and what is a form shadow. So that's going to be the focus of this video. And since I'll be making this more realistic, I decided to go ahead and change up the colors, give this a warm lighting environment with some very cool shadows, and also give her a dress just to help make this more family friendly. Now, of course, there are different kinds of edges. The edges we are concerned with are ones that go between light and shadow. So we're not concerned about this. This is shadow against shadow, shadow against shadow. Now we do have light against shadow here, but this is the outer edge of the dress, an outer edge of an object that is simply ending and then another object begins. So we're not concerned about that either. Same thing with this separation right in here. So again, we're looking for edges between light and shadow that is not the outer edge of an object. And among these edges between light and shadow, we need to identify whether it is a form shadow or a cast shadow. Let's look at these objects in Blender to really help us understand this. So we've got a light that's shining in from above and to the right. And a lot of the light is shining on this plane, which is almost directly opposed to that light source. But then these planes in here, they're facing in different directions. And so they're getting less and less light as this cylinder is turning away from the rays of that light. And so this is what we call a form shadow, where the shadow is created when the object turns away from the light. Same thing is happening in here on the sphere. But we also have edges where the silhouette of the object is being cast onto something else. This object isn't turning away from the light at any point. And if this cylinder wasn't here, we would definitely have light on this plane. But because this cylinder is here, this area is blocked. And it's a little bit easier to see when we turn ourselves. You can imagine how the light just can't touch this area because the cylinder is in the way. Now, as I said before, we're not concerned about edges like this because this is just the end of the object. We're also not concerned about this edge in here since this is light and this is light. What about this edge in here? Is it form or is it cast? And we have to ask ourselves if the object is turning away from the light. So the plane is going, say, this way, and then it cuts down, it turns away from the light right there. So this is actually a form shadow, just like this one. The reason why this one is getting darker and darker and kind of fading into a shadow is because of the curve of the object. But here, the edge is turning abruptly, so the light is dropping off immediately. But many objects in nature turn softly, turn with curves. And so that's why we often simplify this principle into saying that form shadows should be soft and cast shadows should be relatively sharp. Now this all might seem really basic to you, but I see people struggling with this all the time. When we increase the complexity, if I take a cube in here and connect these two, what happens then? When this is one object, but the planes are changing, creating form and cast shadows on the same object itself. So let's grab a few more objects. I'll have this larger sphere, and then I'm going to move this up so we can see it a little bit better, something like that. So we've got this cube in here, cylinder, cube, large sphere, small sphere. Okay, and I'll give you a moment to look at this in its 3-dimensional form. And now let me show you what these things are. We've got a form shadow at the top, and then this is a form shadow on the side. Cast shadow onto the cube here. We also have a form shadow from this cube as it turns away from the light, which then casts a shadow onto this larger sphere. And look at how this curved on here because of the shape of the sphere. We've got this cast shadow that seems to run all the way down through here, and a form shadow on this sphere in here. And then over here, this is definitely a form shadow. And then this in here can either be one of two things, but it's going to be a sharp edge regardless. Sometimes we'll have an object that just begins right here, and so that would be a sharp edge, it'd be the beginning of an object, right? Or it could be that this form shadow is casting the shadow of the sphere, which is landing on this other sphere and creating this sharp edge. Either way, that's going to be a sharp edge. And so this kind of back and forth, form shadow, cast shadow, form shadow, cast shadow, form shadow, cast shadow, form shadow, and then there'd be a cast shadow on the ground. We see this pattern happening in nature all the time. So that brings us back to this drawing. So I'll just add a new layer here, 2 colors for our form and cast. So this will be form, this will be cast. So let's look at this edge in here. Is that being created by the object turning away from the light? And the answer is no. This is a cast shadow coming from the head. What about this edge in here? Is that object turning away from the light? Yes, yes it is. So generally speaking, this will be form. What about this in here? Well, you might be tempted to say that this is a form shadow all the way through. But imagine with me what a sphere might look like in this space. Shining in the light, some light on table, clean up the shadow a little bit better. It would have a cast shadow coming from the side. So this edge right here, where this curve ends and this new edge begins, that's a cast shadow. That's actually what we're seeing right here. And it can be a little bit easier to see on this edge. So what we actually have is this form shadow, which then turns into a cast shadow, and then resumes its way into a form shadow again. Same thing on the other side. This would be form shadow, and then this on either side would be cast. Moving down over here, this would continue to be form. And then what about this? Well, this is actually a little confusing to me. I'm not quite so sure. So rather than jump to a guess, I'm going to look to see if there's anything else that I can quickly identify. And this to me is clearly a form shadow because that leg is turning away from the light again. And this part that's turning away from the light, well, every time a form shadow is made, it creates a cast shadow. So this is actually the beginning of the silhouette of the leg being cast onto her torso. Coming down over here, so now looking at the light and shadow from here to here. And you might say that we don't need to do this one because this is the end of the object. But actually, if that dress is three-dimensional at all, we could actually be seeing a little bit of shadow right as the fabric of that dress is turning back into itself. We then have a cast shadow from the dress on the leg, and then we resume our form shadows in here. You could say that this kneecap is starting to create a silhouette onto the other part of the knee, but then it would quickly turn back into form shadow because that knee is still turning away from the light. And then this in here is actually, something is wrong. I missed this. The actual shape of light would look something a little bit more like this. And this would be a form shadow resuming its journey until it tapers off where we can't see it anymore. Coming down to the feet, we've got a cast shadow which is coming all the way from the knee up in here. And then this edge is form. And hopefully you're beginning to see some patterns emerging. This pattern of form cast going down the body. And we also have form shadows generally going in a direction that is perpendicular to the light, while cast shadows are falling in a direction that is parallel to the direction of the light. So that could be another indication that's helping you identify what is a cast and what is form. Moving on over here, obviously this is all going to be a cast shadow on the top of her foot, because otherwise this would be in the light if something wasn't blocking it. And if we had a little bit of a shadow, as we should, just creeping down under here at the bottom of her foot, we would actually have a form shadow, and then we would have a cast shadow at the very bottom, cast onto the ground. So it can get pretty nuanced. I'm just looking at this from this overall perspective. Coming over here into the hand, we're not concerned about this edge, but we are concerned about this one as it's rolling into shadow. The hand is turning away from the light. So this is a very loose breakdown of the form and cast shadows, but it's interesting to see that there's this kind of form cast that is a very common pattern throughout nature. I have the understanding I need to proceed with confidence. Basically, I'm just going to be trying to blur these edges down where there are form shadows. How much of a gradient I do will have an impact on how much we perceive, like how curved, how slowly does that turn away from the light. That's definitely a big factor. So I'm just quickly smudging these. You could grab additional values that would go nicely in between, add some more color and life, but I'm just showing this just to show you what happens when you simply soften these edges. The nose is going to be turning pretty fast, so I do want it to be a little bit soft, but it doesn't need to be really soft. So in here, The form is going to be significantly impacted by how much I decide to soften these, like our impression of its form. I don't know that this needs to be really soft. There's kind of rib cage involved. This is such a sculpting phase. Like, if you can get your shapes really good with your placement, then working with these kinds of edges is just a lot easier. Now this area, I feel like there would definitely be more work involved in there, but it's going to do the job for now. Again, there could be a lot more variance in light and shadow. These are just very basic forms. It would just take a little bit more work than I'm willing to put in right now. It's a little bit, it kind of feels like a 3D rendering, but we're establishing the impression of form more and more. You can imagine what would happen if we started to adjust our values and bringing in more details on top of this, what that would start to do. And again, I'm always thinking about like how soft do I want this to be? So these things have to be relative to each other. So this is a little bit soft, but I could keep a little bit soft, and as long as this is softer, it should do the job. Do you want to watch my shape? Okay, so it's kind of beginning to look and feel like a real knee. Might even be an extra toe in here or something like that. Now, if you add another piece of light like this, where there's a dropping into shadow and then coming back into light, we would have this be form shadow. It then hits the edge of the object, so this would stay sharp, or we might see a little bit of a cast shadow. Either way, it's going to be sharp. But then here again is when it gets soft. I'm really not liking how that's turning out, but you're seeing the idea. So from here, we could actually just go straight to our highlights. So this is relatively warm compared to this. The highlight of that is going to be cool relative to this, because this is going to be the warmest thing. The absolute warmest thing is going to be in the transition between light and shadow. Let me go ahead and do that. So I'm going to take a new kind of brush, one that is pressure sensitive, and I'm just going to start to bring this into here. So I'm just going to add this warmth. Okay, so now I may have bit off more than I can chew. You know, sometimes I like to experiment, and maybe I should not have tried to experiment while explaining a concept. So we've got these kind of funky colors, and I probably went overboard, but I'm going to go up into a highlight that again is going to be relatively cool to my lights, but still warm compared to my shadows. And so I can look for places where I might need to put those. I'm curious to see what this would look like if I just removed the saturation. And there we go. So despite my crazy colors, we actually have a three-dimensional image underneath the surface of it all. I probably should have used colors that are a little bit less crazy, wouldn't have gotten us distracted, but hopefully you can see how just by identifying what should be form and what should be cast plays such a massive role in creating the impression of 3 dimensions. I think if I just change the color of the shadow to something a little bit darker, there we go. Probably needs to have some kind of a highlight by her toes to help anchor her to the ground. A little bit of a highlight at the bottom. But just to summarize, remember where the light source is coming from to help you think about the planes and whether or not the object is turning away from the light. In addition to that, for more complicated areas, if the angle of the shadow is doing this, then it's more likely to be a form shadow. If the angle of the shadow is more like this, then it is more likely to be a cast shadow. That is, if it's more parallel with where the light source is coming from. Another helpful tip is that a form shadow always creates a cast shadow. So anytime you see a form shadow, start looking for where the cast shadow from that form shadow would be. If you think about it that way, we actually start with form shadows up here, and then we go cast form, cast form, cast form, all the way until we get to cast at the very end. So shadows always start with form shadows and they end in cast shadows. If you'd like to see me do more of this, maybe over a more realistic photograph, then let me know in the comments and I'll consider making a video for that specifically. Thank you everyone, and have a beautiful day.